The thing that is hurting you right now is not the thing you think it is. You believe it's the comment someone made, the bill you can't pay, the person who left, the mistake you keep replaying at 2 a.m. But none of those things are touching you directly. What's touching you is the grip you have on them. And the strange, uncomfortable truth is this: the moment you stop gripping, the pain doesn't disappear because the world got kinder. It disappears because you stopped carrying something that was never yours to carry in the first place. That sounds impossible right now, maybe even insulting. If you've been hurting for a long time, someone telling you, just let go, can feel like someone mocking you. So this isn't going to be that kind of video. This is not a video that tells you to let go and then walks away. This is a video that shows you, piece by piece, what you're actually holding, why you're holding it, and how the old teachers, the ones who sat with their own suffering for years before they said a single word about it, figured out how to set it down. Tonight, as you listen to this, you're going to feel something shift. Not because the words are magic, because you're finally going to understand the weight you've been carrying, instead of just feeling crushed by it. Here's the problem almost nobody says out loud. You wake up already tired. Not tired from sleep, tired from yesterday's arguments still running in your head, tired from tomorrow's worries you haven't even lived yet, tired from a version of yourself you're constantly trying to protect, defend, or fix. You go through your whole day holding your breath without realizing it. You flinch before anyone even says anything unkind. You brace. And braced people don't live, they survive. That's the quiet tragedy so many of us are inside of, without ever naming it. The Buddhist path was never about becoming someone who feels nothing. It was about becoming someone who can feel everything and still stand steady. That's a different kind of strength than the one we're taught to chase. And it starts with understanding exactly what we've been carrying. The weight you don't know you're holding. Most people think suffering comes from what happens to them. A loss, an insult, a failure. But the old teaching says something sharper. Suffering comes from what we add on top of what happens. Something goes wrong, and there's a first pain, quick and real. Then there's a second pain we build ourselves. The story, the why me, the replaying, the resentment we keep feeding for years after the moment itself ended. And the strange thing is, most of us never even notice we're doing this. We think the pain we feel today is the same pain from back then, still fresh, still alive, still happening. But it isn't. It's a copy we've been redrawing over and over, each time adding a little more color, a little more detail, until the copy feels more real than the original moment ever was. Picture someone carrying a stone in their pocket. The stone was handed to them on a bad day. They didn't ask for it. Someone said something cruel, or life took something they loved, or they failed at something they cared about deeply. In that first moment, the stone was simply there, heavy, unwanted, real. But instead of setting it down, they keep it. They touch it when they're anxious, running their thumb over its rough edges, like a habit they don't remember starting. They show it to people as proof of what happened to them, pulling it out in conversations that had nothing to do with it, saying, "You don't understand what I've been through," as if the stone itself could explain everything about who they are. Years pass, and the stone has grown heavier, not because it changed, not because the day it came from grew any worse in hindsight, but because they never stopped holding it. They built their identity around the holding. Somewhere along the way, the person carrying this pain became easier to be than the person who used to carry this pain and finally set it down. This is the trap nobody warns you about. Pain has a natural shape and a natural ending. A cut heals, a loss softens with time, even if it never fully disappears. But we interrupt that natural process constantly. We pick the wound open again, just to check if it still hurts. And of course it does. because we just picked it open. Then we tell ourselves, "See, I'm still hurting," as proof that the wound is permanent, when really, we're the ones keeping it fresh. This isn't weakness. It's not even a mistake in the way we usually think of mistakes. It's simply what happens when nobody ever taught us the difference between feeling something fully and holding on to something forever. We were taught to be strong, to push through, to not make a big deal out of things. But we were never taught how to actually release what we're pushing through. So we carry it, instead, quietly, for years, sometimes for decades, without ever realizing that carrying was never required. Think about how differently a child experiences pain compared to an adult. A child falls, cries hard for 2 minutes, and then runs off to play again, like nothing happened. Not because the fall didn't hurt, it clearly did, but because the child hasn't yet learned to attach a story to it. There's no inner voice saying, "This always happens to me," or "I probably deserved that," or "This proves something is wrong with me." The pain simply moves through them and leaves. Somewhere between childhood and adulthood, most of us lose that ability. We start attaching meaning to every wound, and meaning is sticky. Meaning is what turns a moment into a stone. The old teaching isn't asking you to stop feeling pain when it happens. That would be denial, not wisdom, and denial always finds a way to leak out sideways later, usually onto people who didn't deserve it. What the teaching asks is something much more honest. Notice when the moment has actually ended, and notice what you're choosing to keep going after it's over. The insult was said once. The loss happened once. The failure occurred on one specific day, at one specific time. Everything after that, every replay, every imagined argument, where you finally say the perfect comeback, every night spent turning the same memory over, like a stone in the dark. That's not the original event anymore. That's you, alone, sharpening a story that keeps cutting you every single time you touch it. There's a quiet kind of relief in seeing this clearly, even though it might sting at first. If you're the one who's been adding the weight, that means you're also the one who has the power to stop. This isn't blame. Nobody handed you a manual for grief or anger or shame. Nobody sat you down and said, "Here's how long you're allowed to hold this," before it starts holding you instead. You did the best you could with what you knew, which was, hold on, because letting go feels like losing, feels like forgetting, feels like saying it didn't matter. But holding on and honoring something are not the same thing. You can remember a loss without dragging it through every new day. You can acknowledge an insult happened without replaying it as if it's still happening right now, in this room, to this version of you. Imagine setting the stone down on a table instead of in your pocket. You can still see it. You can still walk over and look at it whenever you want, remember exactly where it came from, even feel its weight again if you choose to pick it back up for a moment. But it's no longer pressing against you with every step. It's no longer something your hand reaches for out of habit before you've even decided to. That's the difference between remembering and carrying. Remembering respects the past. Carrying lets the past keep happening to you long after it's actually over. This is why the first principle matters so much, more than people expect from something that sounds so simple. Almost every kind of unnecessary suffering in a human life traces back to this one habit, the refusal, often unconscious, to let a finished moment actually finish. We keep paying for things that were already paid for. We keep flinching from wounds that have already closed, just because our hand keeps returning to the same spot to check. And the moment you finally notice this pattern in yourself, without shame, without turning it into another stone to carry, something loosens. Not everything, not all at once, but something. And that loosening is where every other kind of freedom in this life quietly begins. It helps to notice how differently this weight shows up in different people. even though the underlying mechanism is always the same. For some, the stone shows up as anger, a low simmer that never fully cools, ready to boil over at the smallest new provocation, because it's really being fed by 100 old ones. For others, it shows up as anxiety, a constant bracing for the next version of the same old pain, as if the body has decided that staying tense is somehow a form of protection. For others still, it shows up as numbness, a kind of quiet shutting down, because feeling the full weight even once felt unbearable, so the mind found a way to feel almost nothing instead. None of these are character flaws. They're all just different shapes the same unprocessed stone takes when it's never given the chance to be set down. There's also a common misunderstanding worth clearing up here, because it trips up so many people who are genuinely trying to heal. Letting go doesn't mean pretending something didn't happen. It doesn't mean forcing a smile over a wound that's still raw, or rushing yourself toward forgiveness before you're actually ready for it. Real release usually isn't quick, and it isn't clean. It often looks less like a single dramatic moment of transformation and more like a long, quiet, repeated choice. Noticing the stone in your hand again for the 1,000th time, and gently, without judgment, choosing to loosen your fingers just a little more than you did the day before. Some days that choice is easy. Other days the grip tightens right back up out of pure habit, and that's not failure either. That's simply what it looks like to unlearn something the body has been practicing for years. What tends to help most isn't willpower, even though so many people try to muscle their way through it with sheer determination. What helps is honesty, sitting with the stone for a moment, actually looking at it instead of avoiding it or clutching it tighter, and asking simple, quiet questions. What exactly am I still protecting by holding this? What do I believe will happen if I finally put it down? Sometimes the honest answer is fear. Fear that letting go means the pain didn't matter, or that the person who caused it gets away with something, or that setting it down means admitting you were weak for carrying it this long. But none of that is actually true. Setting the stone down doesn't erase the fact that it once existed. It simply means you've decided your hands have better things to hold now. There's a kind of lightness on the other side of this that's hard to describe to someone who hasn't felt it, because it isn't loud or dramatic. It's not some euphoric breakthrough. It's quieter than that. It's the strange relief of noticing, one ordinary afternoon, that a memory which used to bring your whole body to attention now just sits there, a little sad, a little distant, but no longer sharp enough to cut. It's the surprise of realizing you went a full day without thinking about something that used to consume every waking hour. That's what setting the stone down actually feels like in practice. Not a single dramatic moment, but a gradual return of space in your own chest, room you didn't even know you were missing until it came back. Wanting is a hole that doesn't fill. There's a kind of hunger that has nothing to do with food. You get the job, and almost immediately your mind starts scanning for the next one. You get the relationship, and instead of settling into it, some part of you starts noticing what's missing, what could be better, what it isn't yet. You buy the thing you'd been wanting for months, and within days, sometimes within hours, it stops feeling new. The excitement fades so quickly, it's almost embarrassing, and underneath that fading excitement is a quiet, uncomfortable question. If that didn't do it, what will? This isn't a personal failure, even though it often feels like one. It's not a sign that you're ungrateful, or broken, or impossible to satisfy. It's simply how craving works. Craving was never built to be satisfied. It was built to keep moving, always pointing toward the next thing, because satisfaction was never really the goal in the first place. The wanting itself became the identity, the engine, the thing that gets you out of bed and keeps you chasing, right up until it exhausts you completely. Think of someone drinking salt water because they're thirsty. In the moment, drinking makes complete sense. Their mouth is dry, Their body is asking for relief, and the water is right there, so they drink. But salt water doesn't work the way regular water does. Each sip pulls more moisture out of the body than it puts in. So instead of quenching the thirst, it deepens it. And because the person still feels thirsty afterward, their first instinct isn't to question the water, it's to drink more of it, faster, assuming they just haven't had enough yet. This is exactly what craving does to us with almost everything we chase. We assume the problem is that we haven't gotten enough of the thing yet, so we go back for more, and more, and more, and the thirst never actually breaks, because the thing we're drinking was never capable of quenching it to begin with. Most of us have been drinking salt water for years without ever stopping to check the label. We tell ourselves a very specific and very convincing story. The next achievement will finally be the one that makes me feel like I've arrived. The next relationship will finally be the one where I stop feeling alone, even when I'm with someone. The next version of myself, thinner, richer, calmer, more accomplished, more admired, will finally be enough. And for a moment, right after we get whatever it is, there's a flicker of relief. It feels like proof that we were right, that this one really was going to be different. But the flicker fades faster every time, and the space it leaves behind feels a little emptier than before, because now we've also spent our energy chasing it. This is not because the things themselves are bad. A job can be meaningful. A relationship can be one of the most important things in a person's life. None of this is saying that wanting things is wrong, or that achievement is empty by definition. What it's pointing at is something underneath the wanting, the assumption, buried so deep most people never examine it, that something outside of us is eventually going to fill a space that was never designed to be filled from the outside. The hole isn't shaped like a job, or a relationship, or a purchase. It's shaped like something else entirely, something quieter, something that has more to do with how you relate to yourself than with what you're able to acquire. And no amount of external success, no matter how impressive, can reach into that particular shape and fill it, because it simply isn't built for that. There's an old picture that captures this well. A person standing in a room full of open doors, walking through one after another, expecting that behind at least one of them will be the room where the hunger finally stops. They walk through the door of success, then the door of recognition, then the door of comfort, then love, then status, then rest. Each room looks promising from the outside. Each room disappoints slightly once they're standing in it, not because the room is bad, but because they were looking for something the room was never holding. Eventually, if they're honest with themselves, they start to suspect that maybe it isn't about finding the right door at all. Maybe it's about the fact that they kept walking past the one place they never thought to look, right where they were already standing. The old teaching doesn't say stop wanting things. That would be an impossible instruction, and probably an unwise one too, because desire, in a healthy form, is part of what makes a human life move and grow and create. What the teaching says instead is far more useful and far less extreme. Notice the hole you're trying to fill, and ask honestly, without flinching away from the answer, whether anything outside you was ever actually going to fill it. Ask it about the job. Ask it about the relationship. Ask it about the version of yourself you think you're supposed to become. Not to talk yourself out of wanting good things, but to stop mistaking those things for something they were never meant to be. That single question, asked sincerely and repeated honestly every time the old pattern shows up again, has ended more suffering than any amount of chasing ever could. Because the moment you stop expecting the outside world to hand you peace, you're finally free to enjoy what it does offer. A good job, a real connection, a small victory, for exactly what it is, instead of quietly resenting it for not being the miracle cure it was never capable of being. The salt water was never going to satisfy the thirst. But once you know that, you can finally go looking for the kind of water that actually does. It's worth noticing how sneaky this pattern can be, because it rarely announces itself clearly. Nobody wakes up and consciously thinks, "I am going to spend today drinking salt water." Instead, it disguises itself as ambition, as self-improvement, as simply wanting a better life, which makes it almost impossible to catch in the moment. You tell yourself the reason you feel restless is that you haven't achieved enough yet, so the obvious solution seems to be achieving more. You tell yourself the reason a relationship feels hollow is that you haven't found the right person yet, so the solution seems to be searching harder. The craving is clever this way. It always points outward, always suggests the fix is one more acquisition away. And because that story feels so reasonable, so responsible even, most people never think to question it until they're exhausted, standing in the middle of a life full of things they once believed would be enough, still feeling the same quiet hunger they started with. There's a particular kind of tiredness that comes from this specific chase, different from ordinary physical exhaustion. It's the tiredness of someone who has been running for years without ever really knowing what they were running toward, only that stopping felt somehow more frightening than continuing. This is often the tiredness sitting underneath people who look, from the outside, like they have everything figured out: the promotion, the relationship, the image of a settled life, and yet privately feel like frauds, because the peace they expected all of it to bring never actually arrived. Nobody warns you about this particular kind of disappointment, mostly because the people who reach these milestones rarely talk about how empty they still feel once they get there. There's a strange shame attached to admitting that the thing everyone told you would make you happy didn't. But there's good news buried in this discomfort, if you're willing to look at it directly instead of running from it. The exhaustion of endless craving is actually a doorway, not a dead end. It's the moment where a person finally has the chance to stop and ask a completely different kind of question than the ones they've been asking their whole life. Not what do I need to get next, but what am I actually looking for underneath all of this wanting? And almost always, when people sit with that question honestly, long enough for the noise to settle, the answer that surfaces isn't more accomplishment or more approval or more possessions. It's something much simpler and much closer than that. A sense of being enough exactly as they are, right now, without needing the next achievement to prove it. That sense was never something to chase, because chasing implies distance, and this particular thing was never actually far away. It was just buried under years of assuming it had to be earned from the outside. None of this means ambition is the enemy, or that wanting a good life is somehow spiritually wrong. There's nothing noble about denying yourself things you genuinely want, and pretending otherwise usually just creates a different, quieter kind of suffering. The real shift isn't in what you want. It's in what you expect that thing to give you once you have it. Want the job because the work itself matters to you, not because you think it will finally silence the restlessness. Want the relationship because you genuinely love the person, not because you're hoping they'll fill a space that was always meant to be filled from within. That small shift in expectation changes almost everything about how the wanting feels, turning it from a desperate grasping into something closer to genuine appreciation, which, unlike craving, never runs dry. Everything you're afraid to lose, you never owned. This one is heavy, so sit with it gently, instead of flinching away from it. Nothing you have is permanently yours. Not your health, not your youth, not the people you love, not even the version of you that exists right now, because that version is already changing as you listen to this sentence. Your body is replacing cells while you sit here. Your mind is quietly forming new opinions, new fears, new hopes, some of which will replace the ones you're holding on to today. This isn't meant to frighten you. even though the first time it lands, it often does. It's meant to free you from a grip that was crushing your hands the entire time, a grip so constant you probably forgot you were even holding on. Imagine holding sand tightly, afraid it will slip through your fingers. It's a strange thing to watch, if you ever actually try it. The tighter you close your fist, the faster the sand escapes through the gaps between your fingers, pushed out by the very pressure meant to keep it in. But open your hand, palm flat, fingers relaxed, and the sand simply rests there, undisturbed, for as long as it's meant to. This is such a small, physical example, but it captures something most people spend their whole lives fighting against, without realizing it. We think tightening our grip is what keeps things close to us. We think if we just hold on hard enough, love hard enough, control hard enough, we can stop the natural movement of life. But the grip itself is often what pushes things away faster, or at the very least, it's what turns every single day we do still have them into a quiet, low-grade panic, instead of something we can actually enjoy. This is impermanence, not a punishment, even though it can feel like one in the moments we're not ready for it. Not proof that life is cruel or that nothing matters. It's simply a rhythm, the same rhythm that runs through everything alive. Seasons change, and nobody stands in a field in October demanding that the leaves stay green forever, because we've made peace with that particular kind of ending. We expect autumn. We even find it beautiful, the way the trees let go of what they no longer need, without drama, without resistance, trusting that spring will bring something new in its place. Rivers move constantly, carving new paths, never staying in exactly the same shape for 2 days in a row, and yet we still call it the river, still recognize it, still love it, even though it is never, technically, the same water twice. People arrive in our lives, and people leave, some through distance, some through disagreement, some through death, and every single one of those endings hurts in its own particular way. But the hurt of the ending is not the same thing as the hurt we add when we spend the entire relationship bracing for the day it will end. Think about how differently a person experiences a vacation depending on how they hold it in their mind. Someone who spends the whole trip thinking about how soon it will be over often barely experiences the trip at all. They're standing on a beautiful beach mentally rehearsing the flight home, the return to work emails, the ordinary Tuesday waiting for them at the end of it. The beauty is right there in front of them, and they're missing almost all of it, because their attention has already left to go stand guard over the ending. Compare that to someone who knows just as clearly that the trip will end. Nobody is confused about that, but who has decided not to spend the trip defending against its ending in advance. That person tastes the food more fully, notices the light on the water, remembers the trip for years afterward, with a kind of warmth the first person will never quite manage, because the first person was never actually there for most of it. This is exactly what happens with the people we love, the health we have, the years we're currently living through. When you stop demanding that things stay fixed forever, something counterintuitive happens. You don't love them less because you know they won't last forever. You love them more because you're finally present for them, instead of standing guard against a future that hasn't happened yet and might not happen the way you fear at all. Parents who understand this hold their children a little differently, knowing the age they are right now will only exist for a few more months before it's gone forever, replaced by a new age, a new phase, a new version of the same beloved child. Instead of that thought creating dread, in the people who've made peace with impermanence, it creates a kind of tenderness, an attention to the present moment that people who are still gripping tightly rarely get to experience. None of this means you stop caring, or stop trying to protect what matters to you, or stop grieving when losses actually happen. Impermanence isn't an instruction to feel nothing. It's an invitation to stop pre-grieving things that are still here, to stop spending today's joy on tomorrow's uncertain sorrow. The stone from earlier, the salt water from before, both of those were about things that already happened, weight we kept adding to old moments. This one is different. This one is about the fear of things that haven't happened yet, a fear so persistent that it quietly steals the very moments it's supposed to be protecting. Open your hand, not because you don't care what's resting in it, but because you finally understand that closing your fist was never actually protecting anything. The sand was always going to move, always going to shift, always going to eventually slip away in its own time, in its own way, exactly the way everything alive eventually does. But an open hand gets to feel the sand while it's there, warm, real, present, instead of spending every single second in a battle it was destined to lose. That's not resignation. That's the closest thing to real love that most people ever manage to learn. It's worth being honest about how frightening this idea can feel the first time it truly sinks in, because pretending otherwise would be dishonest. There's a particular kind of quiet terror that can rise up when you really let yourself absorb the fact that everyone you love, including yourself, is temporary. Most people spend enormous energy avoiding this thought entirely, keeping it at the very edge of awareness, glancing at it only in moments they can't avoid. A funeral, a diagnosis, a milestone birthday that suddenly makes the passing of time impossible to ignore. But avoiding a truth doesn't make it less true. It only makes it more disruptive when it eventually forces its way in, usually at the worst possible moment, usually without warning. There's a different way to relate to this same fact, one that doesn't require pretending it isn't real, but also doesn't require living in constant dread of it either. Some of the people who seem most at peace with impermanence aren't the ones who've stopped caring about what they might lose. They're the ones who've simply stopped spending their present moments defending against a future loss that hasn't happened yet. There's an important difference between accepting that something will end someday and assuming it's ending right now, today, in this conversation, in this ordinary Tuesday afternoon. Most anxiety around impermanence isn't actually about the eventual ending at all. It's about living every single day as if the ending were already underway, which quietly poisons the very time you still have. Think about how this shows up in something as ordinary as aging. A person who is terrified of impermanence often spends their years fighting the evidence of time rather than living inside of it, treating every gray hair, every new line on the face, every small physical change as an enemy to defeat, rather than simply a sign of having lived. Meanwhile, someone who has made a different kind of peace with the same passing years often carries those same changes differently, not because they don't notice them, but because they've stopped treating them as proof that something valuable is being stolen from them. The years happened, the living happened. The marks left behind are evidence of that, not an insult layered on top of it. This same shift applies to relationships in a way that changes how people actually show up for each other. Someone who's constantly bracing for a relationship to end often behaves in ways that make the ending more likely, pulling back emotionally to protect themselves in advance, testing the other person to see how much they can withstand, keeping one foot permanently out the door just in case. Meanwhile, someone who has accepted impermanence without being ruled by fear of it tends to love with a strange kind of boldness, precisely because they're not spending their energy guarding against the future. They know the relationship, like everything else, won't last forever in its current form. But knowing that doesn't stop them from being fully present inside it while it's here. And ironically, that full presence is usually what makes whatever time they do have together deeper and more meaningful than it would have been otherwise. None of this erases the pain of actual loss when it eventually comes, and nobody who teaches this is pretending it does. grief is real, and it deserves to be felt fully, not bypassed with borrowed wisdom about the nature of impermanence. But there's a real difference between grieving something once it's actually gone and grieving it in advance, over and over, for years, while it's still right here in front of you. The second kind of grief steals far more from your life than the first ever will, because the first happens once, in its own time, and eventually softens. The second one repeats endlessly, quietly draining color out of days that were never actually taken from you at all, only imagined as already lost, long before they ever were. The self you're defending isn't fixed either. We spend so much energy protecting our image, being right, being seen a certain way, defending a version of ourselves we built years ago and never updated. Someone questions a decision we made, and instead of simply looking at the decision, some part of us jumps up immediately to guard something bigger, something that feels like it's under attack even when it isn't. Someone disagrees with an opinion we hold, and the disagreement lands less like information and more like a threat, as if the opinion itself is somehow load-bearing, holding up the entire structure of who we believe we are. This happens so automatically, so many times a day, that most people never stop to ask a simple, honest question. What exactly am I protecting so hard? And more importantly, is that thing even still true? Here's the quiet truth almost nobody sits with long enough to really absorb. The you from 10 years ago is not the you reading this right now. This isn't a metaphor or a spiritual exaggeration. Your cells have changed, replaced many times over through the ordinary process of being alive. Your beliefs have changed too. Even the ones you'd swear right now are permanent. Because beliefs you held with total certainty a decade ago have almost certainly already been quietly replaced, updated, or abandoned without you ever holding a funeral for them. Even something as simple and physical as your handwriting has probably shifted over the years, small changes accumulating without your notice, the same way a face changes slowly enough that you never catch it happening, only realize it happened when you compare an old photograph to a mirror. So who exactly are you defending so fiercely in every argument, every wounded silence, every sleepless night spent replaying something someone said about you? A fixed self that was never actually fixed to begin with. This is one of the strangest tricks the mind plays on all of us. We build an idea of who we are, competent, kind, right, misunderstood, whatever the specific story happens to be, and then we spend enormous energy defending that idea as if it were a physical structure that could actually be knocked down. But an idea isn't a wall. It's more like a photograph of a wall taken years ago, and we're standing in front of it, screaming at anyone who dares to suggest the wall might look different now. There's an old image of a river that captures this better than almost anything else. You can never step into the same river twice, the old teaching says, because the water has already moved on by the time your foot touches it again, and so have you. The river looks the same from a distance. It has the same banks, the same general shape, the same name on every map. But the actual water rushing past your ankles right now was somewhere else entirely a moment ago, and will be somewhere else entirely a moment from now. Nothing about the river is standing still, even though it appears, on the surface, to be the most stable, unchanging thing in the landscape. This is exactly what a human self is like, whether we're comfortable admitting it or not. When someone insults you, they're almost never actually insulting the river as it exists in this exact moment. They're insulting a snapshot, a memory, an idea they formed based on something you said or did at some earlier point, sometimes years earlier, sometimes just yesterday, but always slightly behind the actual, living, constantly moving person standing in front of them. And just as often, when we defend ourselves furiously, against an insult, we're not actually defending who we are right now either. We're defending an old photograph, a version of ourselves we've decided to freeze in place and guard at all costs, simply because it's familiar, simply because we've spent years building a fortress around it. Once you see this clearly, something remarkable happens to the way arguments feel. Arguments lose some of their grip, some of their teeth, because you're no longer defending a fortress that could theoretically be destroyed. You're just watching water move. Someone says something harsh about a choice you made 5 years ago, and instead of your whole body tensing up to defend that choice, as though your entire identity depends on it, you can simply notice. That was a decision made by an earlier version of the river, a version that no longer exists in exactly that shape. You can even agree, if it's true, that the decision wasn't perfect, without that agreement threatening anything real, because the person who made it isn't fully the person standing here anymore anyway. This doesn't mean you stop having opinions, stop making choices, stop caring what happens to you or how you're treated. It means those opinions and choices stop being treated like permanent monuments that must be defended to the death every time someone questions them. You can hold a belief firmly today and let it evolve tomorrow, without that evolution meaning you were foolish before or dishonest now. You can make a decision you're proud of and still remain open to the possibility that a future version of you might see it differently, without that openness meaning the current version is weak or uncertain. There's a particular kind of freedom that comes from loosening your grip on a fixed self, a freedom that people who haven't experienced it often mistake for instability, as if knowing who you are requires pretending you'll never change. But real stability doesn't come from freezing yourself in place. It comes from trusting the river to keep being a river, no matter how many times its water changes shape, no matter how many bends it takes that nobody could have predicted from the source. The banks hold, the direction remains roughly the same, but the actual substance flowing through it is allowed to move, allowed to be different tomorrow than it was today, without any of that threatening the underlying continuity of the whole. Most conflict between people, if you trace it back far enough, isn't actually about the thing being argued over. It's about two people each defending a fixed idea of themselves, terrified that if they bend even slightly, the entire structure they've built will come crashing down. But nothing crashes down when a river changes course. It simply continues, in a new shape, still recognizably itself, still flowing toward wherever it's going. The moment you stop needing to defend an old snapshot and start trusting the actual, living movement underneath it, most arguments lose the desperate edge they used to carry. You're not fighting to survive anymore. You're just two rivers, momentarily crossing paths, each one free to keep moving, without needing the other to stay perfectly still. There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from spending years defending a fixed self, one that's easy to miss, because it doesn't feel like a single dramatic event. It feels more like a low, constant hum underneath everything, a background tension that never fully switches off, because some part of the mind is always on guard, always scanning conversations for the next potential threat to the story it's protecting. People who live this way often describe feeling tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, because the exhaustion isn't physical, it's the accumulated weight of defending something, day after day, that was never actually under the kind of threat it felt like it was under. Consider how differently two people might handle the exact same piece of feedback. One person hears a criticism of their work and immediately feels it lands somewhere much deeper than the work itself, somewhere close to their sense of worth, their competence, their entire identity as someone capable and valuable. For that person, the feedback isn't just information about a project. It's a direct hit on the fixed self they've spent years constructing and defending, and so the reaction is often disproportionate to the actual comment, sometimes defensive, sometimes wounded for days afterward over something relatively small. Another person, hearing the exact same words, absorbs them differently, because somewhere along the way, they stopped treating their work, or even their past choices, as permanent extensions of who they fundamentally are. For that person, the criticism can simply be information, useful or not, true or not, but not a referendum on their entire existence. The difference between those two reactions isn't about confidence in the way we usually use that word. It's about how tightly a person is holding on to a fixed idea of themselves. The less fixed that idea becomes, the less any single piece of feedback, any single disagreement, any single insult can actually shake the ground beneath a person's feet, because there's no longer a single fragile structure that the whole sense of self depends on. Instead, there's something more like the river, something that can absorb new information, incorporate it, change shape slightly if needed, without the entire identity threatening to collapse over one difficult conversation. This also changes how a person relates to their own past mistakes, which is often where the fixed self clings hardest and causes the most quiet suffering. Someone gripping tightly to an old version of themselves often can't look honestly at past mistakes without feeling like the mistake defines them permanently, as though admitting a past failure means confessing that they've always been fundamentally flawed in some way. This makes real growth almost impossible, because growth requires the ability to look clearly at what didn't work without collapsing under the weight of that recognition. But someone who has made peace with the river metaphor can look at an old mistake and think, simply, that was a decision made by an earlier version of me, one who didn't yet know what I know now, and that recognition doesn't threaten the current version standing here today. It actually strengthens it, because growth was only ever possible in the first place, because the self was never fixed to begin with. There's real freedom waiting on the other side of this shift, though it rarely arrives all at once. It tends to arrive gradually, in small moments where an old habit of defensiveness starts to feel unnecessary, where a criticism that would have once triggered days of internal turmoil instead passes through more quickly, noticed but not gripped, considered but not clung to. Over time, the constant background hum of self-protection begins to quiet down, not because the world stopped offering criticism or disagreement, but because the part of the mind that used to treat every comment as an attack on a fixed fortress finally understood that there was no fortress there to begin with. Just water, always moving, always becoming something slightly new, never requiring the same desperate defense a fixed structure would. Suffering shared is suffering halved. There's a story about a woman who lost her only child and, in her grief, went from house to house begging for medicine to bring him back. She carried the small body with her, unwilling to accept that nothing could be done, convinced that somewhere, in someone's kitchen or garden or medicine cabinet, there had to be something powerful enough to undo what had happened. People looked at her with pity as she knocked on door after door, and most turned her away gently, unsure of what to say to a grief that big, a grief that had clearly separated her, at least in her own mind, from everyone else standing safely on the other side of loss. A wise teacher finally told her he could help, but first she needed to bring back a single mustard seed, and it had to come from a house that had never known loss. It sounded so simple. A mustard seed, one of the smallest, most common things imaginable, sitting in nearly every kitchen in the village. Surely this would be easy. So she set out with new hope, going from house to house exactly as before, except now she was asking a different question. Not for medicine, just for a mustard seed, from a home untouched by grief. She searched for days. At every house, people welcomed her in, offered her food, offered her a seed without hesitation, because of course they had mustard seeds. Everyone did. But when she asked the second part of the question, whether this house had ever known loss, the answer, every single time, was no different from the last. This house had lost a husband. That house had lost a mother. Another had buried a child of their own years earlier, the grief still visible behind the eyes of the person answering the door. She found kindness everywhere she went. She found generosity everywhere she went. People willing to sit with her, listen to her, offer whatever comfort they had. But she never found a single house untouched by grief. Not one, in the entire village, in all her searching. By the time she returned to the teacher empty-handed, something in her had already begun to shift, quietly, without her fully realizing it was happening. Not because her son came back, because of course he hadn't, and nothing about her searching had changed that unbearable fact. But because somewhere along the way, walking from door to door, hearing the same painful truth repeated in 100 different voices, she realized her pain, as enormous and singular as it had felt standing alone in her own home, was not actually a lonely island, cut off from everyone else's experience. It was part of the same vast ocean that everyone around her was swimming in too, quietly, often invisibly, each person carrying their own version of exactly what she was carrying. This is the principle so many people miss when they isolate with their pain, convinced somewhere deep down that what they're going through is uniquely theirs, uniquely unbearable, uniquely misunderstood by everyone else who seems, from the outside, to be doing just fine. Suffering feels heavier in silence and secrecy, partly because silence removes the natural relief that comes from simply being witnessed, and partly because secrecy allows the mind to quietly convince itself that nobody else could possibly understand this particular flavor of pain. Both of those beliefs feel true in the moment, and both of them are almost always false, in ways that only become visible once a person finally, hesitantly, opens the door and lets someone else see what they've been carrying. It becomes lighter, not smaller, the moment you realize you are not the only one carrying something like it. This distinction matters more than it might seem at first. The pain itself doesn't shrink just because someone else has felt something similar. The loss is still the loss. The grief is still exactly as real and exactly as large as it was before. But the weight of it changes. The way a heavy piece of furniture becomes easier to carry the instant a second person takes hold of the other end. Not because the furniture got lighter, but because it's no longer being carried alone. Shared suffering doesn't erase suffering. It changes its shape, from something crushing and isolating into something that, while still difficult, becomes bearable in a completely different way. This is part of why so many people who go through genuinely difficult seasons of life describe, almost universally, that the hardest part wasn't the grief or the fear or the sickness itself, but the loneliness that came from believing nobody else could possibly understand it. And it's also why, so often, the turning point in someone's healing isn't a solution to the actual problem, which frequently has no solution at all, but simply the moment they finally spoke it out loud to another human being and heard, in response, some version of "me too." Those two small words carry an enormous amount of quiet power, not because they fix anything, but because they instantly dissolve the myth of the lonely island, replacing it with the truth of the shared ocean that was there the entire time, hidden just beneath the surface of everyone's carefully composed exterior. This doesn't mean every person you open up to will understand, or that vulnerability is always met with kindness, because sometimes it isn't, and that's its own kind of painful lesson. But it does mean that somewhere, almost always, there is a house that has known exactly the kind of grief you're carrying, even if it takes some searching to find it. The mustard seed was never the point of that old story. The walking was, because it's in the walking, in the asking, in the slow realization that everyone's door hides some version of the same ache, that isolation quietly begins to loosen its grip, and something that once felt unbearable to carry alone becomes, if not easy, at least something you no longer have to hold entirely by yourself. It's worth asking why isolation happens in the first place, because almost nobody chooses it consciously. Nobody wakes up during a hard season and decides, deliberately, to suffer alone rather than reach out. Isolation usually creeps in quietly, through small decisions that each seem reasonable in the moment. Not wanting to burden someone else with your problems, not wanting to seem weak or dramatic, or like you can't handle your own life. Assuming, without ever really testing it, that other people are too busy, too happy, too unaffected by their own struggles to have room for yours. Each of these small decisions feels considerate, even responsible, but stacked together over time, they build exactly the kind of silence that makes suffering feel far larger than it actually is. There's also a particular kind of shame that often accompanies pain, a shame that has nothing to do with logic and everything to do with old, deep patterns most people never examine closely. Somewhere along the way, many of us absorb the idea that struggling is a kind of failure, that needing support is evidence of weakness, rather than simply evidence of being human. This belief rarely gets stated outright. It usually hides underneath more socially acceptable reasons for staying quiet, being strong for everyone else, not wanting to worry people, preferring to handle things independently. But underneath those reasons often is a quieter fear, that if people really saw how much you were struggling, they might think less of you, or worse, they might confirm the very thing you're secretly afraid is true about yourself. This is exactly why the old story about the mustard seed still matters so much, centuries after it was first told. The woman in the story wasn't just looking for medicine. She was, without fully realizing it, testing a private and painful belief, that her loss had somehow marked her as different, set apart, uniquely unlucky in a world where everyone else seemed to have been spared. Every door she knocked on chipped away slightly at that belief, not through any grand revelation, but through the simple, repeated evidence of ordinary people admitting, one after another, that they too had buried someone, that they too knew exactly the shape of the grief she was carrying. By the time she stopped searching, she hadn't found a magic cure. She had found something arguably more valuable, proof that she was never actually as alone in it as the grief had convinced her she was. This same pattern plays out constantly in smaller, less dramatic ways throughout ordinary life, not just in the aftermath of major loss. Someone struggling quietly with anxiety assumes everyone else around them feels calm and in control, right up until they finally admit it to a friend and discover the friend has been fighting the exact same private battle for years. Someone going through a difficult financial season assumes everyone else has it figured out, right up until an honest conversation reveals that most people, behind their composed exteriors, are also quietly stressed about money in ways they rarely admit out loud. The specific circumstances differ endlessly from person to person, but the underlying experience of hidden struggle and the relief that comes from discovering it isn't actually hidden from everyone else too, repeats itself over and over in nearly every corner of human life. None of this means suffering should be treated casually, shared indiscriminately with anyone willing to listen, without care for timing or trust or the right kind of relationship for that kind of honesty. Vulnerability still requires wisdom about who deserves it and when. But it does mean that the instinct to hide, to protect others from your struggle, to convince yourself that nobody could possibly understand, deserves to be questioned rather than automatically obeyed. More often than not, somewhere close by, sometimes closer than you'd ever expect, there is someone quietly carrying a weight, strikingly similar to your own. simply waiting, just as hesitantly as you are, for someone else to go first. Peace is not the absence of storms. We tend to imagine peaceful people as people who simply have less happen to them. Somewhere along the way, most of us picked up a quiet assumption that calm is something you achieve by arranging your outer life carefully enough. The right job, the right relationships, the right amount of money, the right amount of control over every variable that could possibly go wrong. And so when storms inevitably show up anyway, because they always do, no matter how carefully a life is arranged, it can feel like proof that peace was never really possible in the first place, or worse, that we're simply doing something wrong that other people have somehow figured out. That's not true, and it's worth saying clearly, because this misunderstanding causes so much unnecessary despair. Peace was never about calm circumstances. It never depended on an absence of difficulty, an absence of loss, an absence of uncertainty. It's about something else entirely, a steady center that doesn't collapse when circumstances stop being calm, a kind of internal ground that remains standing even while everything around it is shaking. This is a completely different definition of peace than the one most of us grew up absorbing, and understanding the difference changes almost everything about how a person relates to hardship when it eventually arrives. Picture a candle flame in a closed room. No matter how much noise or movement happens outside those walls, wind howling, storms raging, doors slamming somewhere in the distance, the flame inside stays still, steady, upright, because it's protected from the wind, not because the wind stopped blowing somewhere out there in the world. This is such a simple image, but it captures something profound about the difference between a peaceful life and a peaceful person. A peaceful life, if such a thing even exists, would require controlling every external condition perfectly, forever, which nobody has ever managed to do. A peaceful person, on the other hand, doesn't require the outside world to cooperate at all. They've built, slowly and often painfully, an inner shelter sturdy enough that the wind can howl exactly as hard as it wants, without ever quite reaching the flame itself. The old teachers weren't people who avoided hardship, and it's important to say this clearly, because there's a tempting but false version of spiritual peace that imagines wise people floating serenely above ordinary human suffering, untouched by the same grief and fear that touches everyone else. That's not what actually happened, historically or otherwise. Some of the most respected teachers of inner peace lost everything before they ever taught a single lesson about how to find it. They buried loved ones. They faced illness, betrayal, poverty, and public ridicule. They were not spared from the storms that hit everyone else. What made them different wasn't a storm-free life, which nobody gets, no matter how disciplined or devoted they become. What made them different was a flame that had learned, slowly and painfully, over years of practice and failure, and starting again, how to stop being blown around by every gust that passed through. This matters enormously for anyone who has ever felt like a failure at peace, someone who meditates or prays or tries every technique available and still finds themselves shaken by hard news, still feels their hands trembling when something goes wrong, still lies awake at night when life gets difficult. None of that means the practice failed, or that peace was never really available to that particular person. It simply means the flame is still in the process of being sheltered, still learning, gust by gust, storm by storm, how to stand a little steadier than it did the last time. Nobody arrives at unshakable calm in a single sitting. It's built the same way any strength is built, through repeated exposure, through practicing steadiness in small storms, before ever having to face the larger ones. There's also something important in recognizing that the storm and the flame were never actually enemies in the way we often assume. Wind doesn't exist to destroy a candle out of malice. It simply exists, doing what wind does, indifferent to whatever happens to be standing in its path. In the same way, hardship doesn't arrive in a person's life as a personal attack, even though it often feels that way in the moment. It arrives because that's simply what life does. The same way seasons change and rivers move, and nothing stays perfectly still forever. The goal was never to stop the wind from blowing, an impossible and exhausting task that has broken plenty of people who tried to take it on. The goal was always to build a shelter strong enough that the flame could keep burning, regardless of what the wind outside decided to do. This reframes what it actually means to work toward peace in a practical, everyday sense. It's not about arranging a life free of difficulty, which nobody has ever successfully done despite centuries of people trying. It's about the quiet, repeated practice of returning to your center every single time a storm knocks you off balance, again and again, for as long as it takes. Some days the flame flickers wildly, nearly extinguished by something particularly harsh. Other days it barely moves at all, steady even under real pressure. Both are part of the same ongoing practice, neither one a failure, because the wind will never fully stop, no matter how skilled a person becomes at sheltering their flame. The storms keep coming for everyone, the wise and the struggling alike. The only real difference, in the end, is what's been quietly built to shelter what matters most, one storm at a time. There's a common misunderstanding worth addressing directly, because it quietly discourages so many people from ever attempting this kind of inner work. Many assume that peace, once achieved, becomes permanent, a fixed state a person either has or doesn't have. Under that belief, feeling shaken by a hard event later in life becomes proof that the earlier peace wasn't real, or that all the effort spent building it was somehow wasted. But this misunderstands how the shelter actually works. Building an inner sense of steadiness isn't like installing a permanent fixture that never requires attention again. It's closer to tending a small structure that needs regular care, reinforcement, and occasional repair, especially after an unusually strong storm has tested its walls. This is why people who've spent years cultivating genuine inner steadiness can still be shaken by real tragedy, real loss, real fear, without that shaking meaning their peace was fake all along. The difference isn't in whether the storm touches them. Storms touch everyone, without exception, no matter how sturdy the shelter has become. The difference lies in what happens afterward, how quickly a person can return to their center once the initial impact passes, how willing they are to tend the shelter again, rather than assuming the whole structure has permanently failed just because one storm managed to shake it harder than expected. Think about how differently two people might respond to the exact same piece of devastating news. Neither one is spared the initial shock, the grief, the disorientation that comes with something genuinely difficult. In that first moment, both flames flicker wildly. Both people feel the wind rushing in hard, but one of them has spent years quietly practicing the return to center, small storm by small storm, disappointment by disappointment, difficult conversation by difficult conversation. For that person, even in the middle of something enormous, there's a kind of muscle memory already present, a familiar path back towards steadiness that they've walked many times before, on a smaller scale. The other person, who has never practiced this return, often finds themselves lost entirely in the storm, without any prior experience of what it feels like to find their way back to center once shaken. Both people are equally human, equally capable of being hurt, but one of them has been quietly training for exactly this moment without ever knowing it would come. This is, in the end, what all of this practice is actually for. Not a life without storms, which was never on offer to anyone, no matter how devoted or disciplined they become. Not a permanent state of untouchable calm that some spiritually advanced people supposedly achieve while everyone else struggles beneath them. Just a slowly strengthening shelter, tested repeatedly, rebuilt repeatedly, that allows something essential inside a person to keep burning steadily, even while the wind outside continues doing exactly what wind has always done. The storms were never the enemy, they were simply the ordinary weather of being alive. And the flame, however small it starts out, was always capable of learning to hold steady inside them, one gust at a time, for as long as it needs to keep burning. Attention is the only thing you actually control. You can't control what someone says about you. You can't control the traffic, the diagnosis, the economy, or how someone else chooses to treat you, no matter how fair or reasonable your expectations might be. Most of a person's daily frustration comes from exactly this mismatch, from spending enormous energy trying to control things that were never actually within reach to begin with. We negotiate with the weather in our minds. We rehearse arguments with people who aren't even in the room, trying to control how a future conversation will go before it's even happened. We replay decisions other people made, wishing so hard that they'd chosen differently, as if wishing hard enough could somehow reach backward and rewrite what already occurred. None of that effort ever actually works, and yet most people spend years pouring themselves into it anyway, because the alternative, accepting how little of the outside world is actually theirs to direct, can feel, at first, like giving up entirely. But there is one thing you have always had control over, in every single moment of your life, even the very worst ones, even the moments that felt the most chaotic and unbearable, where you place your attention next. This single fact, once it's truly understood, quietly changes the entire relationship a person has with difficulty. It doesn't remove the difficulty. It doesn't make painful things stop being painful. But it restores something that so many people feel like they've lost completely during hard seasons of life. A sense of actual, functional power, small as it might seem at first, over what happens inside them even when everything outside refuses to cooperate. Someone insults you, and there's no version of reality where you can undo the insult once it's been said. The words exist now, they happened. But you can choose whether your mind builds a courtroom around it for the next 3 hours, replaying the scene, drafting the perfect comeback you didn't think of in the moment, assigning motives to the other person, running the whole exchange over and over, as if repetition alone might somehow change the outcome. Or you can choose, not easily, not always successfully, but genuinely, to let your attention move somewhere else, back to the meal in front of you, back to the conversation you were actually having before the insult interrupted it, back to the ordinary texture of the rest of your day, which was still there the entire time, quietly waiting for your attention to return to it. Something goes wrong, a mistake, an accident, a piece of terrible news, and there's no undoing the event itself either. But you can choose whether you rehearse it 50 times, turning it over and over until it feels like it's still happening, or whether you actually deal with what's directly in front of you right now. This specific task, this specific person, this specific breath, instead of living entirely inside a memory that keeps replaying without your permission. This distinction sounds subtle when it's described this way, but in practice, it's the difference between a person who feels dragged through their entire day by every difficult thing that's ever happened to them, and a person who feels like they still have some genuine say in how their day unfolds, even in the middle of real hardship. This is not about pretending nothing happened, and it's worth being clear about that, because there's a shallow, dismissive version of this idea that sometimes gets mistaken for the real thing. Pretending nothing happened is denial, and denial always costs something eventually, usually resurfacing later in ways that are harder to manage than if the original difficulty had simply been acknowledged honestly from the start. This isn't that. This is fully acknowledging that something painful occurred, giving it its due weight, feeling whatever needs to be felt about it, and then, once that acknowledgement has happened, choosing not to let it hijack every single moment that comes afterward. The event gets to be real. It doesn't also get to own the rest of your day, your week, your year, unless you keep handing it that ownership over and over through where you continue placing your attention. It's about understanding that your attention is the last piece of ground you always stand on, no matter what's happening around you, no matter how much chaos or unfairness or genuine tragedy surrounds a particular moment in your life. Everything else can be taken. Health can be taken. Relationships can end without your consent. Reputation can be damaged by people telling stories that aren't even true. Circumstances can shift in ways nobody saw coming and nobody would have chosen. But attention, in its most basic form, the simple act of deciding what to notice next, has never actually belonged to anyone else. It's the one piece of territory that remains yours, even in the middle of complete external chaos, even when every other form of control has clearly been stripped away. People spend their whole lives feeling powerless because they never realized this ground was theirs the entire time, mistakenly believing that power only comes from controlling outcomes, other people, or circumstances. But outcomes were never fully controllable to begin with, not by anyone, no matter how much money or status or planning they have. Real, lasting power was always something smaller and closer than that, something available even to a person with almost nothing else, a prisoner, a patient in a hospital bed, someone grieving a loss they never chose. Even in circumstances stripped down to almost nothing, the choice of where to place attention next remains, quietly, stubbornly, always available. This doesn't make hardship easy. It simply means hardship is never the complete picture. There is always, even in the darkest moment, this one remaining piece of ground, still standing, still yours, still waiting for you to notice you never actually lost it. It helps to notice how differently this plays out, depending on where a person's attention habitually goes without them ever choosing it consciously. Some people's attention drifts, almost automatically, toward what's missing, what went wrong, what could still go wrong next. This isn't a moral failing. It's often simply a well-worn path, built over years, sometimes built for good reason during earlier periods of real danger or instability, when scanning constantly for threat actually served a purpose. But a path that once made sense can keep running long after the danger that created it has passed. And a mind trained to search endlessly for the next problem often finds one, or invents one, simply because that's the direction it's been trained to look. Other people's attention, through different circumstances or different practice, tends to settle more easily on what's actually present, what's actually workable, what's actually within reach, in this specific moment, rather than in some imagined future or replayed past. This isn't because their lives contain less hardship. Often, it's the opposite. Some of the steadiest people alive have lived through some of the hardest things imaginable. What differs isn't the difficulty of their circumstances. What differs is the direction their attention has been trained, deliberately or accidentally, to travel first when something hard occurs. This matters because attention, like almost everything else about a person, can actually be trained, the same way a muscle can be trained, through repeated, deliberate practice, rather than sheer force of willpower alone. Nobody redirects a lifetime of automatic worry through a single decision made in a difficult moment. That's setting an unrealistic bar that almost guarantees discouragement the first time it fails, which it usually will. Instead, the training happens in much smaller moments, dozens of times a day, almost too small to notice individually. Catching the mind drifting into an old argument, and gently, without self-criticism, guiding it back toward the actual task at hand. Noticing a spiral of worry about something that hasn't happened yet, and choosing, again, to return attention to what's real and present right now. Each of these small redirections seems insignificant on its own, barely worth mentioning, but stacked together, over weeks and months and years, they slowly reshape which direction a person's attention naturally travels when something difficult shows up. There's also an important distinction between controlling attention and suppressing feeling, one that often gets confused. This practice was never about refusing to feel anger, sadness, fear, or any other difficult emotion when something painful happens. Suppression tends to backfire eventually, pushing feelings underground where they quietly influence behavior without ever being consciously examined. What's being described here is something different, allowing the feeling its rightful place, letting it move through fully, and then, once it's been genuinely felt, rather than avoided, choosing not to let the mind construct an endless loop around it that keeps recreating the same pain long after the original moment has passed. Feeling something once, fully, is very different from replaying it 50 times under the disguise of processing it. One is honest, the other is often just another form of the very grip this teaching keeps returning to, dressed up as something more acceptable. What makes this practice worth the effort, worth the patience it requires, worth the inevitable failures along the way, is what it slowly restores to a person who's been feeling powerless for a long time. Not control over the world, which was never realistically available in the first place, but something closer to home, something that was always available and simply forgotten, the quiet, steady knowledge that no matter what happens next, no matter how unfair or sudden or devastating, there remains one piece of ground that belongs entirely to you, waiting patiently for you to remember you never actually stopped standing on it. Compassion is the weight that doesn't feel heavy. Here's something strange nobody expects, something that runs against nearly everything most people have been taught about protecting themselves from those who've hurt them. Carrying compassion for others, even people who hurt you, is somehow lighter than carrying resentment toward them. This sounds backward at first. Resentment feels like strength, like standing your ground, like refusing to let someone off the hook for what they did. Compassion, by comparison, can feel dangerously close to surrender, as if choosing it somehow means the wrong that happened didn't matter, or that the person responsible gets to walk away without consequence. But this is one of those places where what feels true in the moment and what's actually true over time turn out to be almost opposite from each other. Resentment feels like justice in the moment, and there's real satisfaction in it, at least initially. It feels powerful to replay what someone did, to rehearse all the reasons they were wrong, to imagine the perfect moment where they finally understand the damage they caused. For a while, this can feel almost like control, like you're the one holding something over them, like your anger is somehow keeping score in a way that matters. But that feeling doesn't last the way people expect it to. It sits in your chest like a stone you never put down, the same stone from earlier in this teaching. Except this particular stone has a name attached to it, a face, a memory that keeps sharpening itself every time it's picked back up. Years can pass, and the resentment doesn't fade the way people assume it will, simply through the passage of time. It often grows heavier instead, because every retelling, every fresh replay, adds another layer onto a weight that was already difficult to carry in the first place. Compassion, even for someone difficult, doesn't ask you to excuse what they did. This distinction matters enormously, because so many people avoid compassion entirely out of a fear that it requires forgiveness they're not ready to offer, or worse, that it requires pretending the harm never happened. That's not what's being asked here. Compassion can exist fully alongside a clear, honest acknowledgement that someone caused real damage, that their actions were wrong, that boundaries are needed, sometimes permanently, to prevent further harm. What compassion actually asks is much narrower and much more specific than forgiveness or reconciliation. It just asks you to stop dragging their weight around with your own, to stop letting their actions continue shaping your inner life indefinitely, long after the actual event has ended, and in many cases, long after they've stopped thinking about it entirely themselves. This last point is worth sitting with honestly, because it's often the detail that finally makes compassion feel less like weakness and more like simple practicality. Many people who caused harm, particularly harm born out of their own carelessness, insecurity, or unresolved pain, spend remarkably little time thinking about the damage they caused afterward. Meanwhile, the person who was harmed often spends years replaying it, carrying it, letting it quietly shape decisions and relationships and self-image long after the original moment has passed. There's a strange unfairness hidden inside resentment that rarely gets acknowledged directly. The person who caused the pain often moves on, relatively unburdened, while the person still gripping the resentment continues paying for an injury that, in the most literal sense, isn't even actively happening anymore. Think of two travelers on the same road, each one having endured similarly difficult things along the way. One carries a backpack full of every wrong ever done to them, replaying each one at every mile, examining each injury from every possible angle, keeping the details sharp and vivid through constant repetition. The weight of that backpack grows with every mile, rather than lightening, because it's never actually set down, only added to, one grievance at a time. The other traveler faced comparable hardship, comparable unfairness, comparable pain. But at some point, not easily, not without real effort, that traveler set the backpack down, somewhere far behind, and now walks the same road with empty hands. Still remembering what happened, still capable of naming it clearly if asked, but no longer required to feel its full weight with every single step forward. Both faced the same amount of hardship, only one of them is still exhausted by it. This is the part that so often gets missed in conversations about forgiveness and compassion, which tend to focus entirely on what the wrongdoer deserves, rather than what the person carrying the weight actually needs for their own sake. Setting the backpack down was never really about the other person at all. It was about the traveler's own shoulders, their own ability to keep walking without being slowly worn down by something they're still hauling from miles, and sometimes years back down the road. Compassion, real compassion, is not weakness, and it's worth saying this plainly because the confusion between the two causes so many people to avoid something that could genuinely lighten their lives. Weakness would mean pretending harm doesn't matter, allowing repeated mistreatment without boundaries, abandoning your own sense of what's right in order to keep the peace. Compassion isn't any of that. Compassion can exist alongside firm boundaries, alongside honest anger when anger is warranted, alongside a clear refusal to allow further harm. What compassion changes isn't your standards for how you should be treated. It changes what you do with the weight of what already happened, once the moment itself has passed, and only the choice of how to carry it forward remains. It's the only weight you can carry that somehow makes you stronger the longer you hold it, unlike almost everything else described throughout this entire teaching, where the instruction has consistently been to set weight down rather than pick it up. Compassion is the rare exception, a weight that behaves differently than every other kind of burden, growing lighter rather than heavier the longer someone practices carrying it, eventually becoming so natural it barely feels like weight at all. It becomes, over time, less like carrying something and more like simply how a person moves through the world. Open-handed, clear-eyed about what happened, unwilling to pretend the harm wasn't real, but finally, mercifully, free of the extra stone that resentment always insists on adding to an already difficult road. It's worth being honest about how difficult this actually is in practice, because compassion towards someone who genuinely hurt you rarely arrives easily or quickly, and anyone claiming otherwise is probably describing something shallower than what's actually being pointed to here. The path toward it usually moves through anger first, sometimes for a long time, and that anger deserves its place, deserves to be felt fully rather than rushed past in an effort to appear more spiritually evolved than the situation actually calls for. Compassion offered too early, before the anger has been allowed its honest expression, often isn't real compassion at all. It's usually just another form of avoidance, a way of skipping past something uncomfortable rather than actually working through it. Real compassion, the kind that genuinely lightens the load rather than simply papering over it, tends to arrive only after the harder emotions have been given their honest due. There's also an important difference between compassion offered to someone still causing active harm and compassion offered towards someone whose harmful chapter has already closed, even if the wound they left behind hasn't fully healed yet. Compassion was never meant to be a reason to stay in danger, to keep tolerating ongoing mistreatment, to keep giving access to someone who continues to cause damage. In those situations, the most compassionate thing a person can often do, both for themselves and sometimes even for the other person, is distance, clear boundaries, sometimes complete separation. The compassion being described here is usually something that becomes possible afterward, once safety has been established, once the immediate danger has passed, when what remains is simply the residue of what happened rather than an ongoing threat still requiring active defense. Consider how this plays out with something as common as a difficult parent, a category of hurt that touches an enormous number of people in ways that rarely get discussed honestly. Someone raised by a parent who was harsh, absent, or unpredictable often carries that particular weight for decades, sometimes their entire life, replaying specific moments with startling clarity even many years later. Resentment toward that parent can feel completely justified, and often it is, given what actually happened. But carrying that resentment forward, year after year, rarely touches the parent at all, especially if the parent has aged, changed, or in some cases already died. What it does touch, relentlessly, is every relationship that person has afterward, every moment of parenting their own children, every quiet insecurity that traces back to lessons learned far too young. Compassion, in a case like this, isn't about excusing what the parent did, or pretending the childhood was fine when it wasn't. It's about recognizing that the parent was very likely acting out of their own unexamined pain, their own limitations, their own unfinished stories, and that understanding this doesn't erase the harm, but it does finally allow the person carrying it to stop needing the parent to change, apologize, or understand in order to set the weight down themselves. This points to something important about how compassion actually functions, which is quite different from how it's often imagined. Compassion isn't primarily a gift given to the person who caused harm. It's primarily a release valve for the person still carrying the aftermath. The wrongdoer may never know it happened. They may never apologize, never understand, never change in any way at all. And yet the person who chooses compassion still benefits enormously, because the benefit was never actually dependent on the other person's response in the first place. This is precisely why compassion can be practiced even toward people who are no longer present, no longer reachable, sometimes no longer alive. It was never really about them. It was always about which weight the person left behind chooses to keep carrying forward into the rest of their life. In the end, this is the quiet reward waiting on the far side of a practice that looks, from the outside, like it's asking you to give something up. It isn't asking you to give anything up at all. It's offering you a way to finally put something down that was never actually serving you, no matter how justified it felt to keep holding on to it. The road ahead is the same road either way, full of its own new difficulties, its own future stones waiting to be picked up or set back down in turn. But one traveler walks it exhausted, weighed down by every old wrong still being carried mile after mile. The other walks it with open hands, lighter, steadier, finally free to meet whatever comes next without the added weight of everything that already happened long ago. Here is the moment that changes everything, if you let it land. You were never actually asked to fix the world, control other people, or guarantee a painless life. You were only ever handed one job: notice what you're gripping, and learn, slowly, gently, without shame, how to open your hand. That's it. That's the whole practice, hidden inside 8 different doors. Every principle you just heard is really the same lesson, wearing a different coat. Stop adding weight to what already happened. Stop drinking salt water, hoping it will finally satisfy you. Stop defending a self that was never fixed to begin with. And start noticing that your attention, right now, in this exact moment, is still yours. Nothing outside you was ever the true source of your suffering. It was always the grip. And a grip, unlike the world, is something you can actually loosen. So go back to that stone in your pocket, the one from the very beginning. Feel its weight one more time, and instead of holding it tighter out of habit, just open your hand. You don't have to throw it far. You don't have to forgive everything tonight. You only have to stop squeezing. That's where peace was hiding this whole time, not somewhere far away, not in some future version of your life, once everything finally goes right, but right here, in the space between your fingers, waiting for you to simply let go. The people who taught this centuries ago weren't asking you to become someone else. They were asking you to stop carrying someone you already outgrew. Sleep tonight a little lighter than you woke up this morning. That alone is enough of a beginning. If this brought you even a little bit of peace tonight, let the next video carry you a little further.